Hello monsters and monster enthusiasts, I'm Monster J Art and welcome to my channel. So in today's video I wanted to share with you 5 beginner mistakes that I did when I started to learn how to draw with Copic markers. So in this video, as my first drawing tutorial, I wanted to share those 5 beginner mistakes and what to do in order to avoid them. So before we jump into the subject, just some quick reminder, you can give a like and subscribe to the channel for more art related content and art tutorials. You can also follow me on Instagram to see pictures of my makeups and my drawings, and you can find the link in the description. So that being said, let's talk about the 5 beginner mistakes I did with Copic marker and how to avoid them. The first beginner mistake that I want to talk about is using the colorless blender the wrong way. So a lot of beginners notice the colorless blender in store and think, well, that's the marker that I have to use if I want to blend 2 colors together. So I'm talking about this bad boy over here. So as you can see, or as you could see if my camera would focus, it's the marker number 0 labeled colorless blender, and for the color indicator on the cap it's transparent. So the mistake is to use the colorless blender to mix together 2 colors that are sitting next to each other, which is one thing that most beginners do instinctively. So I will do a quick demo. I will use these 2 cold grays, C3 and C5. So I will lay them next to each other and try to blend them. So here's C3, here's C5, and then I try to blend. I try to blur the line between the 2, and you see it's not really working. It blurred a little bit, but instead you get that kind of weird splatter of ink, that kind of circle around, and you're like, well, that's not what I was aiming for. So yeah, that's basically the main mistake. It's not the way to blend colors of Copic marker together. I will show you quickly 2 ways. If you want to make a gradient with 2 similar color, here again taking C3 and C5, one thing that you can do, generally I love to go with feathery brush strokes. So you can go first with the darker color, doing those feathery brush strokes, and then use your lighter color going again on top of it, doing those feathery brush strokes. You may need to do a couple of layers, but you can get a smooth gradient from the darker color to the lighter color. If you want to mix 2 colors that are not necessarily making a gradient like this, like a monochromatic gradient, but mix 2 colors together, here I will use C3 and E23 hazelnut. So you can repeat the same process of the feathery brush strokes, but going one side to the other. So I'm bringing my brown on the gray and my gray on the brown. You can repeat the process a couple of times until you get the perfect blend, but that's generally the way of mixing 2 colors together, and it's not, as you can see, I'm not using the colorless blender to do this. So what is the usage of the colorless blender then? I would say the colorless blender is mostly used to blend a color into nothing, or like blending it into the color of the paper. Sometimes I like to refer to the colorless blender as the paper blender, so I will do a quick demo here taking C3 yet again. So if I want to use C3 and blend it with the color of the paper, I will still do my feathery brush strokes, but then I will use the colorless blender to kind of try to push the ink a little further into the paper to get that kind of gradient. Also, don't forget, even if it's the colorless blender, when it's applied it will look a little bit darker, but it will change when it dries, so it will dry transparent. But basically what I'm doing here is I'm taking the gray, reactivate it with the colorless blender, and try to really dilute it away with those feathery brush strokes. So that's the main way you can use the colorless blender. That's the main thing what this marker is made for. But wait, there's more. Other than that, you can use the colorless blender for many different things. You can use it to add texture on an already colored area. So I will do a quick demo using yet again my arty tone E23 hazelnut. So let's say I want to do like a kind of reptile skin texture. So you can use the colorless blender, and I will add like dots of the colorless blender. So basically it reactivates the ink and it will push it on the sides. So as you can see, the brown is now pushed on the edges of those circles of colorless blender, if I can say so, of clear ink. So it does add texture. Maybe you're like, yeah, that's beautiful, but that's a little bit too much. Nothing forbid you to then go over it with your original color, and then you do still get some texture added. You can still see the texture that I added with the colorless blender, but now it's a little less obvious and it blends better. So it's just a more subtle texture in brown. So yeah, you can do it with the colorless blender, but you can do it with other markers as well, especially like the quadruple zero. Here I have YG quadruple zero shade Lily White. You can do the same thing, but instead it will add a slight tint of yellow. So I'll just do a quick demo just to show you the difference, but a lot of those colorless blender technique can also be done with those quadruple or triple zero, like those really light colors. Just to show you how light it is. So I still get the same kind of effect, the same kind of texture, but I do also get a slight tint of yellow. So yeah, that's one way to use the colorless blender. Another main thing that you can do with the colorless blender is to correct mistake. With Copic marker you don't have an eraser, which is kind of frustrating when you start, but you can use the colorless blender to kind of fade your mistake into the void. So let's say I made some, oops, there's a little splatter. I will just make two so that you can compare. So, oh, I didn't want it to have that there. I want to remove it. So you can try to blend it away. So I will just go over it with the colorless blender many times. And as you can see, it's not as well defined. It starts to fade away a little bit. Sometimes you do need to add a lot of the colorless blender, but when it dries down, you will see that the brown will be way less visible. I have to say it is hard to really totally remove a color, but let's say instead with a colorless blender you cannot really erase it, but you can really blend it and fade it way much more. So it's the closest thing you can get to an eraser. The other thing that you can do is to add texture on an underlayer. I will, a little bit like what I did here, but it's another technique. Let's say I love to do this trick when I want to add rust on metal. So I can first start with my spots of rust. So I will do dots of brown. That will be my rust. And then I will go over it with the colorless blender to kind of fade it away, to kind of make the edges of those dots of brown less visible, so kind of fade them away. And then I will use my cold grays that will be used for the color of the metal to go over it. So that's one that will make spots of rust a little more realistic. You can still see them, but they are not that defined. If I just do add them on top of it, you'll see that it's not really great. It's not it's way more defined. It doesn't look really subtle. So yeah, you can use it to first do an underlayer, blend the color, try to fade away the edges of the color, and then going over it with another marker. So these are the main thing that you can do with the colorless blender. It is a very useful marker, but yeah, a lot of people say that maybe colorless blender is not the best way to describe it, but yeah, there's many tricks that you can do with this bad boy. So now let's move on the next beginner mistake. Another beginner mistake is to use the wrong type of paper. So the type of paper makes a huge difference, especially if you want to prevent bleeding. So what's bleeding, you may ask? So here's a quick example. Basically, I used this black liner to draw this rectangle and I filled it using this yellow-green Copic marker. And I don't know if you will see it clearly enough on camera, but basically some of the ink spilled over the line. Even if I was really careful to make sure that I stay between the line, some of it spilled over. So bleeding is when the ink spills outside of where you put it, and the main way to prevent this is by using the right type of paper. So I will show you some example. So these are two types of ink and marker paper that I use. Marker or ink paper is generally more absorbent than regular paper, and it often have an additive to lock it in. So with this one, I'm not sure there's an additive, but with this one there's definitely an additive that helps to keep the ink and lock it in. So the thickness of the paper is indicated by the weight, generally something like gram per square meter. So with this one, you can see it here, it's 118 gram per square meter, and with this one written right here, it's 75 gram per square meter. So I will show you some some samples of the paper. If I put it on the side, slightly tilt, you can see that the 180 gram is thicker, while this one is obviously thinner and bend more easily. So, printer paper is notorious for bleeding. The more layer you apply, the greater the chances that the ink bleeds. I know I've seen some manga artists that say that they use printer paper and say that it's fine, but I have to admit that it really depends on the type of artwork that you do. Sometimes it's because they don't use a lot of layers of ink, or that they use lighter color. So obviously the more layers of ink you add, the more chances that you get bleeding, and if you use darker color, the bleeding will also be more visible. So that's why I know some people don't have issues with printer paper, but yeah, you have to consider that it really depends on how you're working with your markers. So I will do a quick demonstration with 3 different types of paper. So here I will have a sample of the Canson pen and ink. It's the one that I use mostly for testing or doing my sketches. Then I have here the Clairefontaine layout pad. This is the one that I use for my finished work. And I will compare it with regular printer paper. So I will do a quick setup, put a page underneath, and here's a sample of printer paper. So I will put 2 or 3 layers of ink in each, and you will see the result. So first, let's start with the printer paper, then with the Canson pen and ink, and then with the Clairefontaine pad, and then I would add another layer on each. So the main thing also that I wanted to show, I mean, the bleeding, it's not necessarily that big. I also went over the line a little bit by myself, but the thing that I wanted to show you is also underneath. With the printer paper, you see that it went through the paper quite easily, and the ink just spread more. Here I added 3 layers, a little bit went underneath, and with this one, nothing transferred to the paper underneath. I will bring it closer to the camera. So here you can see most of it went through, here just a little bit, and with this one nothing went through. So yeah, that's another demonstration on the importance of the paper that you're using. So the ink can grow through the paper and stain underneath. So if you're drawing directly in a book, like when I'm drawing in this one, generally what I will do is I will take a sheet of paper. Let's say I'm drawing on this page. I will put one right underneath, so to make sure that it doesn't transfer to the other pages. So yeah, that's one way to prevent things like this. But yeah, the type of paper that you use is really important. There's other paper, generally thicker paper. They may not bleed, but sometimes it's just that they will absorb way more ink and you will go through your Copic markers way easily. So some thicker paper will drain the ink out of your Copic. So that's the reason why I prefer also to work with lighter paper. I really love this 75 gram paper. So even if it's thin, it keeps the ink in, it doesn't go through, but it's also clear enough so if I want to trace, if you listen to some of my other video, I do have my my outline on a piece of paper underneath, and I can still see it through this 75 gram paper. So yeah, but yeah, be careful, some heavier paper may drink the ink out of your Copics. Another thing is, as I said, some paper are thin and have an additive to prevent bleeding, but you have to consider that this paper is generally treated only on one side, so it's really important to note on which side. Generally you have one side up, one side down, so if you do it on the wrong side, you may see that it doesn't perform well. So if you work with treated paper, be really careful on the side you're drawing on. Even with the right paper, there is still a limit to the amount of layer that you can put on paper before it starts to react weird. If you apply around 10 layers of ink, you may feel that the color blend weirdly and that the ink just seems to sit on the paper longer than usual. So I will do a quick demonstration here on the Clairefontaine paper. So after a while, I don't know if I will reach that point, but here you kind of see, I don't know if you see, I mean it dries still pretty quickly, but you reach a point where you just see it's more liquid, it doesn't seem to dry, you kind of see that spot in the middle. You will see that after a certain amount of layer, the ink just don't seem to absorb as much, or it just don't seem to dry. So even if you have a good type of paper, you can see here it still stay really shiny. So even if you have some additive or if you use a thicker paper, after a certain amount of layer, the paper will have a harder time to absorb the ink. So you also have to be careful with it, but that's something that you also learn with time, with experience, to not apply too many layers of ink. So this was the second beginner mistake that I wanted to talk about, and now we can move to another one. A common mistake with Copic marker is using the wrong type of pen for outlining. So basically, if you do like a black outline with a pen and then filling the rest in with your Copic markers like a lot of people do for manga, you may get some black smudges around the outline, and that's because not all pens and liners are good to use with alcohol inks. And I will do a quick demonstration. So I will take these Staedtler Triplus fine liner because I know I can't use them with Copic markers, so I will do a quick demonstration. Obviously it can happen with many different other brands, but that's just a brand that I know won't work for me. So I'll just do a simple line and then I will go over it with this Copic sketch. Generally also, personally, I noted that it tends to happen more when you're using the brush nib. So if you go over it a couple of times, so here I'm going a little bit overboard to really create a smudge. I don't know if you will see it clearly on camera, but as it dries down, you start to see that the lines start to get more wiggly, kind of with little dots, and then it kind of, as it dries down, you kind of get a shadow around the line. You kind of see it right here on the corner. You do get that kind of dark gray or light black smudge. So yeah, that's what happens when you use the wrong type of liner. It can happen with many different other tools, like if you use a lead pencil like a HB pencil, you will get a similar kind of smudge. Basically, if the ink of the pen or liner contain a lot of alcohol, the alcohol of the Copic marker can reactivate it a little bit and create a smudge. Or in the case of a graphite pencil, it's basically because it doesn't really sink into the paper, it more like sit on top of it, so just rubbing it with a Copic marker will just spread it a little bit more. So that being said, I want to show you 3 of my recommendation, 3 type of liners that I use for my art that I know won't smudge. Obviously with that, I have to say it's a lot of trial and error. Some of the things that I try may not work for you, or probably more, there's maybe things that work for you that wouldn't work for me. So it really depends on from one person to another, but generally these are options that I know generally work for most people and they work well with me. So first I want to talk about the most obvious solution. I mean, we're talking about using Copic sketches and Copic alcohol marker, but Copic also do liners. So these are the Copic multi-liners. Basically, from the 3 options that I'm talking about, these are probably the most expensive one. They come in, you have like the classical black, but you also have some neutral color, pretty much cold gray, warm gray, browns and sepias. The main reason that I use them is because they come in many different sizes. You have like 0.3, but you have also 0.03, which start to be really small and fine lines. So yeah, if you're looking for really small liners, I do really love the Copic multi-liners. Another option that I love to use, probably the one that I use the most, are the Faber-Castell pit marker. So obviously they come in black, they come in many different sizes. From X small to bold. Small is 0.3, which is kind of the standard size for the liner, and all the colored one, at least around me in the art supply store near me, they only come in 0.3. So what I like about the Faber-Castell pit, at least for me, is that they are a little more affordable than the Copic multi-liner, and they are also a little easier to find in art supply store. So yeah, I don't think I have all the colors for the liners. There's probably more, but in my local store they don't carry that much colors. There are many different sizes. You have these ones that are really liner. There's other one that have like a brush nib, which is also really similar to the Copic, so that's why I don't use them. But yeah, a very good option. These are the liners that I use the most. So yeah, very good option. The last one that I want to talk about are the Stabilos, Stabilo 88. Basically these one, I haven't found them in an art supply store, I found them in an office supply store. I got this pack of 20 pen for 22 bucks. They are the most affordable option. I have to say they are more like regular pen than liners, if I can say so. So basically the main reason I like them a little bit less is that when I use them and I'm doing a line, I feel that if I'm not keeping the same flow for my line, it will show on the line. Like they roll, if I can say so, a little bit less. They don't glide on the paper as easily, I would say, and it kind of shows a little bit. But basically, if I don't have, I will generally prefer to use my Faber-Castell pit, but if there's a color that I need and I don't have it in there, then I will go and use the Stabilo. So it's a very good option, and especially a very affordable one, especially if you're looking for crazy color. That's probably one of the best options that I have. There's a big one, like one of the most famous pen that smudge, or at least that smudge for a lot of people, is the Sakura Microns. I don't have any because I heard that they smudge a lot. If you really want to use some brand of liner or pen that you kind of know they smudge, apparently you should let them dry overnight or for something like 12 hours, and it may prevent the smudging. So with all the marker that I just showed you, you can the Copic, the Faber-Castell, or the Stabilo, you just make a line and then you can go wait maybe 5 or 10 seconds and then you can go on with the Copics. But with other, if you use a pen that may smudge, then waiting a longer time to really let it dry can help to prevent smudging. Also, like I said somewhere else in the video, the paper that you use can also matter. But yeah, I also heard some people say that they have no problem using the microns, but I also heard a lot of people having problem with them. Another option that you may think about is coloring pencils. Coloring pencils are bad for doing outlines since they will kind of just sit on the paper and prevent the ink from getting absorbed. Basically, they will come between the paper and the ink, and the Copic ink will just sit on top of the coloring pencil. But I do use a lot of coloring pencil for finishing touches, so they are really good if you want to do finishing touches that can be added on top of the alcohol markers like Copics, especially using a white coloring pencil to add some highlight. Even there, I would say there are some differences with coloring pencil. That's a different topic entirely. Basically, there are some that are wax based, other that are oil based. Personally, I love to use the Prismacolor Premier and the Faber-Castell Polychromos when I'm using coloring pencil. Also, they can be good even if you're not doing outline. If you want to do like your outline afterward, like going on the edge of where you apply the Copic ink just to make things more even, you can do that with coloring pencil as well. So yeah, that was my main tip. You have to be careful with the type of pen that you are using when you're working with Copic markers. A beginner mistake with Copic marker is relying too much on the color names and code. When you want to make gradients of multiple color, you have to find the right color and in which order to apply them. And it is the most obvious thing to do is to rely on color code. Generally, how the color code works is that you have letters and numbers. There is some exception to these rules, but generally the letters represent the color family. Here it's BG for the blue-greens, and then you have the number that represent the value and saturation. The first number represent the value or the amount of gray in the color. So here you start with 0, something that is really pure and doesn't have gray in it, to 9 where it's really gray. It's almost more like a gray with some blue-green undertones. And then the second number represents the value. Here you have one exception. You have here 00, which represents that it's super light. So you have very low saturation, and then bringing up to 9 where the color gets really deep. You get a very deep blue. And obviously you can work on both at the same time, so you can get something like this, where the color is really deep but also really gray, so you get something that is almost black, like a very deep gray with some blue-green undertones. There is some other exception. You have the art tones. In that case, the first number doesn't represent the value, but it represents a subcolor family, basically some kind of undertones. For that color family. And then you have all the grays, basically C, N, W, and T color families, where you only have one number. Since they are already grays, you don't have a number for the value, since, well, they are already gray, so you cannot really vary the amount of gray in it. So yeah. But one of the beginner mistakes is to assume that the number with the highest digit is always the one with that will be the darkest. That's one of the reasons why one good practice is to do color swatches in another pad to use as reference, and if possible with the same type of paper that you use for your final art, so that you can see what the color will look like for your final piece. And I will show you some example where the color code can fool you a little bit. So we're gonna do it like a little quiz. So I will show you a card like this, give you some time to guess, and then showing the answer. Like, I'll give you probably something like 5 seconds. So here are 3 swatches. One of them is E39, E37, and E35. Can you guess which one is which? So here's the answer. So they were in order: E35, E37, and E39. But if you look at the swatches, E37 actually look a little bit darker than E39. So that's why it is important to do swatches before directly applying it, because you will see that if you want to put E39 to darken things up, you're gonna have a hard time. It will just doesn't really show up on top of E37. Here another example, going back with the blue-greens. So we have BG13, BG11 and BG10. Can you guess which one is which? So here's the answer. You had BG1, BG11, BG10 and BG13. Here, BG10 actually look a little bit darker than BG11. So yeah, it's worth doing your swatches. And then here we have 3 shades of blue, and which one of those is actually B99? Oh, you guessed it. It was the one in the middle. In this case, I think it doesn't show that bad. Maybe it's because of the type of paper that I use for these little cards, but oftentimes I do feel that B39 can actually look darker than B99, so yes, it's worth doing your swatches, but don't assume that B99 is always, that 99 is always like the darkest color. Sometimes you can have some surprises. Another common beginner mistake regarding the color codes is limiting yourself with the color families. When I'm doing like a gradient, a complex gradient using a lot of color, let's say I use 6 or 7 shades to do a gradient, I love to go from one color family to another. Let's say I can make a gradient starting with yellow, then using yellow-red and ending up with some reds. But it is good to experiment. Even if you're doing something that is really more in similar tones, it is good to try markers from different color families. And I will still use some card to do some example. So here's 3 shades of green. Can you guess how many or which ones are actually from the BG color family? Have you guessed? There's actually only one, only the last one, BG11. It's a green and it's a yellow-green. I took this example because one time I was doing a drawing, kind of a zombie, using I wanted to use a lot of greens with blue undertones, and I actually ended up starting my gradient with YG41. Even if it's a yellow-green, it still had some blue undertones. And I put it in a gradient that was going all the way up to BG. So yeah, it is worth not limiting yourself to the color family and doing some experimentation. Here's another one. This time, here's 5 colors. Can you guess which one are from the red-violet color families or how many are red-violets? So I'll give you 5 seconds. And yeah. Actually, there's only one that is a red-violet. This one here, the second one. You have these 2 ones are actually from red. Even here, R56 have some kind of blue undertones to it, but it's still in the red color family. Here you have V93, which is obviously really desaturated, but is really still similar to our V93. So these 2 colors could blend really well together. And you have E04, which is honestly, even if its own color family, if you look at the E0 color family, E04 is kind of an outlier. So even there, it's a hard tone that can fit pretty well with red violets. So yeah, don't limit yourself only on the color names or the color family. But the most common example of this, it's with the hard tones, and especially when you're doing portrait or characters that have fair skin tone, I think it's the moment where limiting yourself, the common mistake is to limit yourself only with the hard tones, because normally the hard tones are the group color family that is made for skin color or hair color, stuff like that. but in fact the art tones is kind of made up of colors from other color family. So I will show you some example of this. Here's 5 color swatches. Can you guess how many of them are from the hard tones and which one are art tones? So here's the answer. There were 3 that were from the hard tones and 2 other that from yellow red and yellow. So you have E41, E51 and E30. As I said earlier, with the art tone, the first digit doesn't represent the value. Here it represents the undertone. E41 is a little more grayish, E51 a little more yellowish, and E31 will turn a little more beige. But yeah, they are all art tone. But then here again you have yellow red 30, which end up looking pretty much like a hard tone. It does really look yellow and doesn't look really red. So you can use it to blend for very fair skin tone and it will give you good result. And here you have Y32, which is a kind of desaturated yellow, but look kind of similar to the E5 color family. So yeah, especially with the art tones, as you can see, probably if the hard tone family, color family wouldn't exist, probably a lot of them would end up in the yellow or yellow reds. So here's the last example of this, yet again also for doing fair skin tones. Can you guess how many of them or which ones are from the E color family? Did you figure it out? So here's the answer. You had 2. So you had E01 and E93. E93 generally turns more like on the orange side of thing. But yeah, you have 2 oranges, YR61 and YR000, that can also be really good, especially YR000 is a color that I love to use when I'm doing pale skin tones. But you also have R30 that obviously look a little more red, but can be used also for skin tones. It's the kind of color that I like to use if I'm doing like the cheeks, I want to put like some blush or something. So yeah, you can use all of those color to do skin tones. So yeah, here the main thing I wanted to show you with all of those examples is don't limit yourself too much on the color code, and especially with the hard tone, because play with your markers, try different things, try different swatches and different gradients. Whenever I'm doing a drawing, I spend a lot of time just trying colors from different color family and swatching them and see in which order also to apply them in order to make the best gradient. But oftentimes it is not rare that I have to go from one color family to another. So yeah, don't limit yourself too much and with the color code and the color family's name, because that's one Copic beginner mistake that I did a lot when I started. A mistake that I did a lot when I started with drawing with Copic marker was putting and removing the caps too often and too close to my sheet of paper. So if you're drawing and you're doing gradients that use different colors, you may have to switch from one marker to another pretty frequently in order to do your gradient. So each time, if you remove and you put on the caps, each time you have some chances that the ink may splatter, and it may splatter on your page. So I will show you with a marker that I use a lot that is a little bit dirtier, so I will bring the lamp closer to show you best. It happened mostly with the brush nib. So why you may get splatter, when you're putting the cap back on, you don't necessarily succeed, put it right in the hole on the first try. And as you can see here, you have some ink that may gather in the cap. So then when you put the caps back on, some of that ink can also accumulate here at the bottom, and then when you completely close it, some of that ink can splatter on your piece of paper. So obviously this one is dirty, and I kept it dirty in order to show it on camera. But if you have something like this, like if you see how dirty the inside is or the bottom of the marker, you can just use like if it's when you're drawing, you can use like a a paper towel, a Kleenex, something like this to remove the ink, or otherwise you can use like alcohol swabs. That's what I love to use in order to remove the ink. So they are alcohol marker, and you have to use something that contains alcohol to remove the alcohol if you're not able to do it with a paper towel. It doesn't have to be fully cleaned, but at least like especially close to where the cap locks, that's where you have to be cautious if you want to prevent splatters. So as I said, that's something that happened by accident a lot when I started. So I will try to make a demonstration and try to do it on purpose. So I will do what I did. I will exaggerate it, being really close to the sheet of paper in order to show you how much splatters you can get. So I will do a gradient of these shades of gray, and I will show you how much splatters you can get from doing it. So as you can see, yes, I did miss. I was a little bit too close, so I hit my piece of paper. But then, even there, if you see it clearly enough, but I got a lot of splatters. Especially, yeah, see it better. I got a lot here, on top. It's kind of hard to see. They are not that dark or with the lighting, but I did got a lot of splatters on the top of the page as well. So I will take a picture and I will show you, so you will see the full splatters on that sheet of paper. But yeah, I was obviously doing it really close to the sheet of paper, try to kind of do it on purpose, but yeah, you can get some serious splatters of ink. Another thing also that can cause splatters of ink, especially when you're using Copic Chow, is that if you put the cap of your marker on the top here and then you put it back this way, you can get some ink that gather here at the top of your cap, and also you get pretty much the same phenomenon that I explained earlier, that putting the cap on and off, if there's ink sitting there, that will create some splatter. Yet again, especially when you're using Copic Chow, it is good to wash the top of your marker after a certain time if they get dirty. So basically what I do to prevent those splatters is that instead of putting the cap on and off completely when I'm making a gradient, I will put them back up, but without locking it. Normally when it's fully on, you hear a click. So I will just let it rest on top without hearing a click. So when I'm working with all my colors, I will put the cap just sitting on top of it, and when I'm done using these colors, then I will put the caps back on, and I will try to do it a little more farther away from my piece of paper. So yeah, it is correct to let the cap sit that way on your marker for a small amount of time, let's say for 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes, but then when I know that I'm done for like doing my gradient, maybe I will use this color later, then I'm putting the cap back on again completely, because otherwise obviously your marker can just dry up. So yeah, this was a mistake that happened a lot when I started, and I will show you some picture of my earliest drawing. Even if I was way more careful, I was not doing it on purpose like I did with this example. I was doing it a little bit like under the sheet of paper, like between me and the sheet of paper. Even there was some splatters of ink, and honestly they are hard to remove. Honestly, what I did is I take pictures of my artwork and I remove those splatters with a software. But yeah, it was pretty frustrating, and then I developed that technique of just letting the cap sitting on top when I'm working, and it prevented the splatter. Even if you're doing it a little, even if I was putting the caps on and off a little further away, if I do it on a drawing of many hours, let's say it took me like 5 or 6 hours to do those drawing, and even with the first one it was even longer than that, then on that period of time you can end up with a lot of splatter after 5 or 6 hours. So yeah, just be careful with your caps. Also, don't be afraid to wash or to remove the excess ink of your Copic marker in order to prevent those kind of splatters. So these were my 5 beginner mistakes while I learned to draw with Copic markers and how to avoid them. So is there any beginner mistake that you did when you started to draw with Copic markers, or is there any mistake that you feel you're doing right now and you want to know how to correct them? If so, please leave it in the comments down below. I hope this video was really helpful, and if so, you can give it a thumbs up. It really helped my channel. You can also subscribe if you want to see more art related content and art tutorials. So, and if so, I hope to see you in another video. Bye!